I don't know how I didn't get my picture on it.
It's trying to mute me.
All right. Welcome everyone to our final presentation of the With Burning Concern retreat. I hope that you all had a nice little break for a few minutes before we started. I just wanted to take a few moments to introduce our last presenter, and that is Bishop John Stowe, who is the Bishop of the Diocese of Lexington, which is actually where I grew up, in the Diocese of Lexington. And his talk is titled Fratelli Tutti as an Antidote to Racism. And so we'd like to thank Bishop John for his time and for his expertise, and I will go ahead and hand things over. Thank you, Bishop.
Thanks. Thank you, Trenton. The Sisters of Charity must be big on punctuality. Started right on the minute. That's great. It's really an honor to be with you today, and especially to do anything for the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, because I know you were part of the Diocese of Lexington from its beginning through your ministries and outreach, and so really wonderful to be connected to you. Many of our priests reflect very fondly on the times that they spent their convocations and retreats at your center there, and lament that they outgrew that space and are no longer able to be there, but really speak highly and fondly of the hospitality that they felt there. I love the title of this day, With Burning Concern, as it came from the response of Pius XII to the growth of Nazism at the time of World War II in Germany. But it also, for me, has echoes of what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, the fierce urgency of now. And I think if anything has happened to us over the summer, those of us here in Kentucky with the killing of Breonna Taylor earlier in the spring, and then the whole nation with the killing of George Floyd, there's been a real necessity of confronting racism individually, institutionally, culturally, and as a church. And I know that the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth have been somewhat leaders in this field already, having wrestled with your own history, being part of the South and being part of Kentucky and part of that institution of human enslavement, and have really worked hard to learn from that, to transcend that, to atone for it, and to plant the seeds for a more fraternal, more relational world that doesn't divide us into categories by race. I have to admit at the outset that following people like Dr. Joseph Flipper, who is quite erudite and who has been a great teacher across the country with his reflections on the institutional racism within the church, within society, and its impact on theology, and Annette Turner, who is a local leader in Louisville, who is so vibrantly committed to her Catholic faith and sees it as much a part of her identity as her African-American heritage and who really enthuses us because she is so eager to share the gifts of the African American community, despite the hurt and rejection that has been felt by that community in the church. It's probably appropriate that I feel a little bit uncomfortable as a white person addressing this issue. But there's one thing I've heard consistently from the African American community in this diocese and beyond, and that is that the African American community themselves are sick and tired of talking about racism because it's an experience that they live with day in and day out. And while they're glad to have more people understanding it and marching with them in the overt manifestations, I've been encouraged by the people of color in our local church to speak because white people need to reflect on this as well and need to learn its lessons. I chose the topic of Pope Francis's most recent encyclical to reflect on this theme because I think both his vision offers us the opportunity to overcome the sins of racism, not in an easy way and certainly not without conversion, but it also heightens, when we contrast the vision that he dreams of with our present reality, it also heightens the sinfulness that allowed us individually and institutionally to buy into the sin of racism, very often without even realizing it, or at least to accept the benefits of white privilege without realizing how we benefit from that. Now, being in central Kentucky, and my diocese includes a good part of eastern Kentucky, I know that those words are hard to hear for many of us. And God forbid we should say things like white supremacy, even though there's good reason for using that terminology because it states a reality pretty boldly and pretty accurately. Nonetheless, we come together to reflect on what has been and what could be, and where the Holy Father is leading us at this time as he wishes for the world to embrace our humanity, to embrace the fact that we have one common Father in heaven and that he made us all brothers and sisters. I know that very often for the white person to speak about racism is an uncomfortability that is necessary for us to experience. And as one of the teachers in my own process of coming to terms with this reality, Father Brian Massingill, who teaches at Fordham University, a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, has challenged me once when I made the mistake of asking him, wouldn't it be better, instead of talking about racism or white privilege, to talk about unconscious bias? And he very easily returned back to me and said, better for whom? Or more comfortable for whom? And why is the criteria for how we talk about race always what makes white people comfortable? Of course, as in every conversation with him and any chance I have to read from him, I'm challenged to look more deeply at my own unconscious bias, the filters through which I understand things, and continue to grow in my appreciation for the vision that Pope Francis defines and describes as a world of brothers and sisters. So Fratelli Tutti comes about this past October 3rd, the vigil of the Feast of Francis of Assisi, just after celebrating a very simple Mass at the very simple tomb of Francis of Assisi in Assisi. Pope Francis signed this encyclical at the altar before that tomb. In many ways, this encyclical builds on his previous encyclical, Laudato Si', which emphasizes humanity's role and the need for an understanding of the interrelatedness of human beings within all of creation. This first Jesuit pope in history has surprised many, including this Franciscan, by his witness to Franciscan simplicity, Franciscan spirituality, and his preaching of a truly Franciscan message. Now, Pope Francis has made several trips to Assisi as Pope. He'd never been there before, and he finds in that medieval village an inspiration for his ministry to the global church because of what St. John Paul II referred to as the spirit of Assisi, and because he's come to know il poverello, the little poor man, who really grew into understanding how all of creation is related as brother and sister. Pope Francis tells us that he chose the name Francis rather spontaneously because as the ballots of the conclave that elected him Supreme Pontiff were being counted, and as those who were keeping track were counting the numbers out loud, and he realized that he had reached the sufficient number of votes to be elected, the fellow South American cardinal, the Franciscan Claudio Humes from Brazil, sitting next to him, grabbed his arm and told him, "Don't forget about the poor." It was at that moment that the name Francis came to him. When he had been advised earlier that he was even the runner-up in the previous conclave and that he should start thinking about selecting a name, even though he brushed off those comments in any public format, he said that internally he was thinking, well, just in case, I'll take John the 24th. Well, any of us who remember John the 23rd, either from history or from real experience, can see the similarities between Francis and John the 23rd, with that down-to-earth simplicity, with that desire to embrace the peace and love of Christ and make it accessible to all people in all places. Now, Francis of Assisi is more popularly known for his love of animals, but what makes Francis of Assisi is his spirituality of the incarnation, something that I know has a connection, a beautiful connection to the Vincentian spirituality lived by the Sisters of Charity and their associates. The basis for his spirituality is the incarnation, God becoming one with us, and in Francis' own language, God becoming a brother to us, the Creator, the Almighty, becoming brother to us. Francis had a deep devotion to the Christ of the incarnation, to Christ in the stable at Bethlehem, rejected by the coldness of the world, born into the rudest of surroundings, yet perfectly comfortable and happy in that place, as he comes to reveal the infinite love the Creator has for creation. His devotion was to Christ at Calvary, the one rejected, spit upon, cursed, derided, ridiculed, hung upon a cross between thieves, out of love, forgiving those who nailed him to the cross, entrusting his spirit to the Father, again embodying, incarnating the love that he knows is the essence of his being and of his Father's being. And Francis' devotion to Christ incarnate continues in the Eucharist, that gift of Christ's self-giving, giving us flesh and blood to eat and drink, to share in, to be nourished by, so that it becomes part of who we are as we become part of his body, the body of Christ, the church. In his devotional reflections and his prayers, Francis of Assisi addressed the Virgin Mary as she who gave the Creator of the world to us as a brother. He celebrated her maternal tender care and that she gave us God as our brother. It's this brotherhood or this fraternity that the human family has to learn if we are to face the challenges of our moment, Pope Francis says, and the yet bigger challenges ahead. Now, the Pope's original plan was to write this encyclical on the theme of interreligious dialogue, something that St. John Paul II was a profound leader on. It was opened up for the church by John the 23rd in the Second Vatican Council. But Pope Francis wants to go back to the Middle Ages, wants to go back between the encounter in 1219 between Francis of Assisi and the Sultan al-Malik in Egypt during the Crusades. Pope Francis wished to build on the goodwill and the common interest in human rights, which he expressed with the chief imam in Saudi Arabia before drafting this document. In the early paragraphs of Fratelli Tutti, the Pope says it was the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic that inspired a much broader message than simply about interreligious dialogue, as important and necessary as it is. It seems that Pope Francis sees the pandemic as a serious dress rehearsal before major ecological crises affect us. And he suggests that if we cannot address the challenge of a pandemic together, what hope is there for the future of humanity? At the same time, and he is quite blunt and quite straightforward in his description of the world and its divisions as it is, he says already in chapter 1, hopelessness is incompatible with the Christian message. It's unacceptable to him as a leader of the church, and so he has to propose a way forward. And for him, it is that vision of worldwide fraternity, living as sisters and brothers, is the way forward. Like the beginning of the encyclical Laudato Si on the situation of the environment, Fratelli Tutti paints a disturbing picture. In each of these encyclicals, Francis avoids sugarcoating the reality, and he avoids using highly technical language. He calls his first chapter Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. And here he describes what he had earlier called the globalization of indifference. The Pope laments that with globalization, we have become neighbors without becoming neighborly, much less recognizing each other as brothers and sisters. He describes some of our human steps backwards, humanity's steps backwards, whether that be the lack of cohesion in the European Union, always threatening to come apart, or the partisan and racial divisions in the United States, or the longstanding refusal to even acknowledge the values of other cultures around the globe. In a phrase that made me wonder whether the Pope had seen too many 2020 presidential election commercials in the United States, he said, the spread of despair, hyperbole, extremism, and polarization, strategies of ridicule, suspicion, and relentless criticism denies the rights of others to exist or to have an opinion. This leads to a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. And victory consists not so much in winning, but in eliminating the opponents altogether. Paragraphs 16 and 17, so pretty early in this encyclical. And true to his nature, the Pope describes the throwaway culture that results in throwaway lives, especially those of the unborn and the elderly. He acknowledged that abandonment of the elderly in our time, in our place, by the most prosperous nations of the world preceded the pandemic, but has been intensified and has been especially on display during the pandemic. Look at the proportion of deaths from the virus that have happened in nursing facilities. The benefits of science and technology, the Pope teaches, are undeniable, but those benefits haven't prevented moral deterioration and haven't prevented the weakening of spiritual values. The Pope says how surprising it should be to us that we can discover faraway planets. Now we have the rover on Mars, but we can discover faraway planets, but can't see the needs of our brothers and sisters orbiting right around us. How true that blindness is for so many of us. The same concern for the peripheries is described as in the previous encyclical and indeed throughout the pontificate of Francis. The Pope says that the virus momentarily, and the emphasis on momentarily, revived the sense of our global community, but then we quickly forget. While we're all faced by the challenge of an invisible virus and many of us facing a vulnerability that we were unaccustomed to, we heard frequently the lines, "We're all in this together." Very soon it became evident that we weren't all in it in the same way together. The Pope described the competition for greater consumption at a level the planet simply cannot sustain, the divisions and violence that results because only a few can achieve that kind of wealth. Even the advances in social media have not made us more neighborly, but allow us to more easily dismiss and ignore people, while at the same time, quote, shamelessly peering into every detail of their lives. As bleak as this picture is, the Pope reminds us that we already have the alternative. That alternative was proposed by Jesus. The seeds of his goodness have already been sown. And as an example, a living example of that, he points to those who have selflessly sacrificed their own health, their own well-being to serve others in the pandemic. The frontline people, the essential workers. And then the Pope goes on to tell the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, reminding us that it was in response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" that Jesus gave that lesson. The Pope emphasizes the Samaritan's foreignness, the Samaritan's lack of standing in the society where he performed his good deed, but his willingness to help one in need while the religious simply walk by. He also notes that the Samaritan couldn't have done it alone. He needed the help of the innkeeper. Acting neighborly can help us see that we are brothers and sisters. What we need to repair our broken world is to follow the example of the Good Samaritan. And if we don't, we're either in the company of the robbers or we're in the company of the indifferent. The Pope then proposes charity and social friendship. What a contrast to what he calls the virus of racism, quote, that quietly mutates, goes into hiding, and lurks in waiting. Solidarity, he suggests, is the result of conversion, not the accumulation of random acts of kindness, not the accumulation of random acts of generosity. It's the conversion that requires thinking of us rather than us and them, or worse, us versus them. That emphasis on conversion is another point of convergence with the environmental encyclical. Nothing will get better until we decide to change to make the world better. We can't use technology to resolve these problems when the problem resides within the human heart. And then Francis uses language that can seem nothing less than bizarre to us, especially in the United States, when he talks about political charity. It sounds almost laughable to our ears. If anything, politics seem to be the opposite of charity, especially in the last year. But Francis gives a simple example that makes it believable, makes it understandable. He contrasts the difference of helping an elderly person to cross a river, which can be an act of charity, and how building a bridge for many people to cross the river safely is an act of political charity. We can do random acts of kindness, taking us out of ourselves to help somebody else, which is virtuous, which is laudable, but it helps one person. We can also pool our resources, pool our minds, and elect leadership that helps us make a better plan for everyone, helping more than just one person. Lamenting the politics that has become a bad word for many of us, the Pope reminds us that politics is supposed to be a noble vocation. especially if one uses the access to power to promote human dignity and the common good, which for us Catholics is the essence of politics, promoting human dignity and promoting the common good. The basic ingredients of Catholic social teaching, or how we're supposed to practice our faith in a pluralistic society. Francis the Jesuit has no difficulty appealing to reason to make his case. He has no difficulty speaking with politicians, with world leaders, with scientists, with searchers, with atheists, with people who view the world very differently than himself. But he knows that more than appealing to reason, it's important to reach hearts. Because the transformation necessary to save the world, the transformation necessary to advance beyond the institutional racism that has imprisoned us, is an affair of the heart. The conversion of the heart is necessary to save the planet. The conversion of the heart is necessary for global cooperation. The conversion of the heart is necessary to see each other as brothers and sisters. We need hearts open to the whole world, and we need to discover the importance of real encounter and real friendship to begin this process of transforming the world. The Pope has emphasized the importance of a genuine encounter with the other. Again, something that's been consistent from the beginning of his papacy. His apostolic exhortation in the first days of his papacy, the joy of the gospel, talked about the importance of the encounter with the marginalized, with those on the peripheries, and through them with Christ. An encounter is not a meet and greet. An encounter is not a wave as one is passing by. It's hard to do a real encounter in a time of social distancing. And as good as this format is for our gathering today with Zoom, it's not the full encounter that we would want. The Pope has emphasized the importance of the genuine encounter with the other, not through technology that can be turned on and off. And since the beginning of his papacy, he's called for a revolution of tenderness to counteract the globalization of indifference. He first used that phrase of the globalization of indifference when he made his trip to Lampedusa. And I know that for myself, after spending 15 years in ministry on the US-Mexico border, I thought I knew quite a bit about immigration, the plight of migrants, the plight of refugees in the world, emphasis on that experience, but understanding it in a broader context. But I had never heard of Lampedusa until the Pope made his trip there. The Pope went to that island off the coast of Sicily because it was the point of shipwreck for many boats carrying human cargo, carrying those escaping war, escaping starvation in Africa, and trying to reach the European mainland. And the Pope lamented how it could be that shipwreck after shipwreck could happen in the Mediterranean there and never even make the newspapers. But the newspapers will spend a lot of ink describing the ups and downs of the stock market, even when it fluctuates by a few points. That's where he draws the comparison or uses the phrase of the globalization of indifference. From the personal interaction. So it was necessary for him in that case to go to that island. It was necessary for him to celebrate Mass on an altar built from the shipwreck of one of those boats. It was necessary for him to take the person who was assigned with the task of being the papal almoner, the papal almsgiver, and move that person from a desk job in the Vatican where they signed papal blessings for people's jubilees and anniversaries to actually encountering the poor. And he sent him down to Lampedusa. And he gave the divers that were going to rescue bodies, he gave them medals to bring along with them in prayer. And he gave phone cards to people who had no way to connect with their people back home to let them know they were still alive. Very practical and very real. But that indifference came because of the color of the skin, the Pope would say, of those who were trying to reach that shore. And how true it is that we find ways to welcome people who look more like us, and we have an easier time turning away for all kinds of good reasons. There's not enough room, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough space, there's not enough this. The system can't hold it. We have a much easier time in our mentality turning away people who look different than us. From this kind of personal interaction, Pope Francis talks about the culture of tenderness expanding and how it needs to expand in our current circumstances to include the role of the United Nations in that political charity to create structures that supersede nations, to govern transnational realities like migration and like climate change. And he calls upon all the religions of the world to engage in dialogue and teach the rest of humanity about the common good and about our common origins as children of God. Now, how can we take the Pope's teachings about children of God seriously, of being one family seriously, when we continuously live the effects of racism? As a white person, I know it's very easy to say slavery was centuries ago, it's been overcome. It's a long time ago, it's not in anyone's living memory. I know it's easy to think that even the civil rights movement and the brutality with which it was put down again and again in the 1950s and 60s was decades ago. And many would point to the fact that our nation elected an African-American president. And then, of course, we saw the backlash or the reaction to that in the subsequent election. Whenever we talk about racism, a big obstacle in that vision of the world of Fratelli Tutti, whenever we talk about racism, those discussions are marked by unease, by tension, by anxiety, by fear, by anger, and by confusion. Nobody wants to be blamed. Nobody wants to take responsibility for what they're not personally responsible for. But many of us in the dominant culture fail to realize how we have inherited the privileges of white culture, even if we didn't participate in enslavement directly, even if we didn't participate in oppression directly, we have benefited from those systems. Denial and divisive responses block the way of this vision of Fratelli Tutti. The question for those of us who profess the Catholic faith, as Father Massengill says in his book, Racism, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, is how can we struggle together against an evil that harms us all, though in different ways? And he, like many of our African-American scholars who have really reflected deeply on the question of racism, point out that racism is harmful even to the dominant culture. Pope Francis would say it's harmful to our salvation. Now, when we talk about racism, it's important, and again, something I learned from Father Brian Massengill, it's important to get beyond what we typically describe as racism. He says that racism has never been solely about insults, slurs, or mere exclusion, even though these are harmful and demeaning. Those are the symptoms of a deeper malady. Racism involves much more than conscious ill will, more than avoiding a person of another color, more than outright malice and violence perpetrated by individuals. Racism is ultimately cultural, he argues. Racism at its core is a set of meanings and values that inform the American way of life. It's a way of understanding and interpreting skin color differences so that white Americans enjoy privileged social status with access to advantages and benefits to the detriment, the disadvantage, and the burden of persons of color. It's amazing to me, having been part of many conversations on this topic, especially in the last year, how that is self-evident to people of color and how it's always contested by white people. I think there's a lesson just in that reaction to those words. The insufficiency of the common sense understanding of racism, that is, person A, usually but not always white, consciously, deliberately, and intentionally does something negative to person B, usually but not always Black or Latino or Native American, Asian, because of the color of his or her skin. But the problem with that definition is that it focuses on individuals. It focuses on deliberate actions. It focuses on the harm received without acknowledging the advantages of the one doing the harming. And so we have to understand racism as a cultural phenomenon that is a way of interpreting human color differences that pervade the collective convictions, conventions, and practices of American life. How do we describe that difference? How do we experience that difference? One of the examples that has been very graphically been pointed out is the Associated Press's reporting on Hurricane Katrina. Of course, now, right now in Louisiana, they're struggling with ice and cold, but Katrina was a major disaster, the hurricane, and the Associated Press saw no difficulty in publishing photos on 2 subsequent days. One described Blacks looting the store for food and material goods, and one the next day, very similar photo showing white people finding food and material goods in a vacated store. It wasn't challenged. The very same scene of people helping themselves to material was looting when it was done by Black people. It was finding when it was done by white people. These are just very basic, simple examples of what happens pretty much on a daily basis throughout the United States. It's not just what we do deliberately, it's our way of interpreting everything, especially interpreting whiteness as normative. People like Father Massingill will talk about the change even of the definition of whiteness. It's not exclusively a racial reality. Each year, I celebrate Mass close to the Feast of All Saints and All Souls in the cemetery in Jellicoe. Part of it's in Tennessee, part of it's in Kentucky. It happens to be in my diocese. And the importance of the gathering, where people come back from all over the country to that cemetery for the Feast of All Saints and All Souls every year, is that was the Italian cemetery. And it was where Italians were buried at a time when Kentucky law considered them colored people, and they weren't allowed to be buried in other cemeteries. Our concept of whiteness changes, but there's always that common denominator of an us and them. There's always the common denominator of someone who is other and not as deserving and not as worthy and has to be kept separate. The Catholic Church has consciously taught about racism in the United States since the 1950s, but many of our African American brothers and sisters would say that they talk about it as though it affects somebody else but not us. And even the language that is used in the pastoral letters of the U.S. bishops about racism talk as though the African Americans are not themselves members of the church. The modern civil rights movement is considered to have been born in 1954 with the Brown versus the Topeka School Board issue. And at that time, the U.S. Bishop Conference issued its first statement on racial justice in 1958, followed by one in 1968, followed by one in 1979. none of which did any kind of social analysis like the ones that would follow in the later letters on peace and economic justice. The Pontifical Council for Peace and Justice in Rome had issued 2 documents on racism, 1988 and 2001. They call racism a radical evil, but don't talk about what are the roots. Radical comes from the roots. What are the roots of that issue? John Paul II, when he visited the church in the United States in January of 1999 in St. Louis, challenged the church to put an end to every kind of racism, a plague which is one of the most persistent and destructive evils of this nation. Not surprisingly, that line wasn't given much press. Throughout the years, throughout the decades, when the church described racism, it was very often focused on individuals or sometimes institutions. On the parish level, the school level, the diocese level. I've told the story a number of times recently about how my mother, who grew up in the Cleveland area of Ohio, when her older sister got married, while being in the Air Force, the family had to travel down to Florida, to Pensacola, where the wedding was to take place. They traveled by train, and they had to get out in Alabama. And it was Sunday when they arrived in Alabama, and they found a place to go to Mass. There was enough of a layover between trains. They found a place to go to Mass. And my mother was appalled, first by the separate drinking fountains, then by the separate restrooms, but nothing more profoundly than the fact that the African Americans had to be in the choir loft. They couldn't be on the main body of the church, and they couldn't receive communion until everyone else had received communion. She said that growing up in an era where nobody questioned the church, she had her first real crisis of faith in the institution when she saw that being accepted as normal by the priest and by the participants. Much more recently, I was welcomed into the home of a couple of very professional people who came from Nigeria and who are teaching at Kentucky State University. Beautiful Catholic family, really instilled beautiful values in their kids, and they're active members of their local parish. And the first time I visited their home, they said, "Well, how do you find Kentucky?" And I said, "Well, people are so welcoming." And the looks on their faces were astonishing to me. I just thought it was part and parcel of who Kentuckians are, and it certainly has been my experience. And they told me how their experience differed so much from my own. They were active in their parish because the faith is very important to them, and they came from a place where you had to be actively involved to make the church thrive. And so they volunteered for ministries in their local parish. And as ministers of communion, when they offered the cup, they saw people switch lines to somebody else. Now they're happy to report they don't see that anymore. But what it said to them as people, what it said to them about how we interpret our faith and what's more important than our faith. The 15 years that I lived on the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, we celebrated a Mass on the Day of the Dead, El Dia de los Muertos, the 2nd of November every year, right at the border, with 2 tables put together through the fence that separated the 2 countries of Mexico and the United States. We made one altar on both sides of the border. We celebrated a bilingual Mass, and with songs that people on both sides of the border knew. We had the same readings, we had the same prayers. People could exchange the sign of peace through the fence. But what a difference there was between those who lived on the south side of that border, looking through that fence and knowing that they had no access to the privilege, they had no access to the wealth, they had no access to what was being done on the other side of the border, where the minimum wage for 1 hour was more than they made in a day, even though the prices were not all that different on either side of the border. And those of us on the northern side of the border could reach through and touch people with our fingers through the holes in the chain link fence and try to exchange the sign of peace that way. But we're really forced to reckon with and question ourselves about which reality was more prominent in our lives. The common Eucharistic table that we claim as Catholics, as members of the Universal Church, or this artificial separation that made it possible for us on the north to go over to the south anytime we wanted, but not the other way around. And beyond that, made it possible for goods and services to come from the south to the north, but not people. The decade since then, that hasn't changed very much. The decade since then, we have only made it more cruel, our policies on the border. Hopefully we're in the midst of a transformation of that at this moment. But our whole approach to immigration has really been based on a racism of us versus them and keeping people out. Our previous president said he'd be fine with more people coming from Norway. I wonder why. Returning to the encyclical of Pope Francis, I'd like to conclude with this, just thinking with him and walking through that parable of the Good Samaritan and what it has to teach us at this moment in our history. Remember that in the encyclical, it comes right after he describes the dark clouds on the dark world. And if any of you watched the Holy Hour and the Urbi et Orbi message that the Pope gave from St. Peter's Square last March 27th, the picture was just painted 1,000 words for real. The darkened sky, the empty St. Peter's Square, the cold rain coming down, and the Pope at the foot of the cross, knowing that he was speaking to a world that was in fear, a world that was isolated, a world that couldn't come together. And he was hoping so much at that moment that we would learn from that isolation about our mutual interdependence. The dark clouds on a dark world, he contrasts with the vision of Gaudium et Spes at the Second Vatican Council, telling us that we have to be light for the world. And Christ provides the ray of light. And that's where he uses the example of the Good Samaritan. He reminds us of the question that Cain asks when God confronted him about the disappearance of Abel, am I my brother's keeper? And he reminds us that the answer is yes, we have a responsibility. He goes through several examples from scripture and tradition about our connections to each other, which are central to the Torah, which are central to the teachings of the faith, which are central to the example of Jesus, who tells us, be merciful as your Father is merciful. And then he reminds us of all the quotes in scripture about the treatment of foreigners, more than anything else in the scriptures, the widows and the orphans, and how Paul and John warn against closed communities. A stranger in need is to be loved no matter where they come from. And then he tells the well-known parable about the man assaulted by thieves and lying injured, and how people holding important social positions were not concerned about him. And the Pope translates that as not concerned about the common good. They had what they needed. They kept going. One person who had no rank, had no place, had no standing in that society, helped very generously. And because he had the means to do so, it suggests that he could have made the same excuses as the other. It wasn't in his plans, it wasn't on his schedule, he had other commitments. He says, at this moment in our history, we each have to read that parable and ask, with whom do we identify? Have we become accustomed to looking the other way? To police brutality towards people of color, towards the immigration situation at the border and people being turned away, or this week living in ice-covered tents, sheaths of plastic protecting them from ice and cold? Is it easy for us to turn away? Or are we truly invested in the common good? Indifference is a symptom of an unhealthy society. Jesus invites us to recover our vocation as citizens of the world. The basic decision we need to repair the whole world is to follow the course of the Good Samaritan, because any other choice puts us in the company of either the robbers or the indifferent. He says it's not a parable about abstract moralizing, it's a lesson about our common humanity. A humane response to suffering is essential to our human dignity, because we all encounter suffering people. How are we to respond? There's only one thing to do. Can we consider the gulf that separates us and suffering around us? Do the poor become invisible, he asks? Do they become unworthy of our notice? That the passersby were religious is more than just a detail in the story, but worship is not enough if we are indifferent to need and suffering, if we're invisible, or if the suffering of others is invisible to us. If we feel hopeless and helpless about a broken system, incapable of action, it's easy to look the other way. But if we recognize in ourselves the injured person, we know that there is a need for help. The neighbor is not limited to those who are like ourselves, and not even those who are physically near. The Samaritan learned to be neighborly, and that is the lesson for us all. The advance from an indifference to neighborliness, and ideally to recognize in our common humanity as brothers and sisters all. There's certainly much more in that encyclical that I would encourage you to read on your own, but I thought it connected very nicely to our understanding of this challenge of racism in our society at this moment in our history, and it teaches us from the very essence of our tradition how we are to respond. And I know that through the institutional works of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, and now with your associates, you have many means for reacting and enacting that neighborliness and that sisterliness to those in need. You have a lot of good to build on. The best thing we can do is also reflect on how we've been protected and how we've been privileged in ways that we don't earn, but because of who we are, and how we might turn that and place it at the service of others. Trenton, do you want to field questions at this time?
Great, that sounds good. Thank you, Bishop Stowe. But yes, I'll look for any hands or chat messages if anyone would like to ask a question at this time.
Not just questions, but comments or
offer comments. Yes, please.
Your own experience.
Oh, Patrick.
I'll make this brief, since I seem to ask a question in every session. You know, I want everybody else to jump in. Before this session, I looked on YouTube for Bishop Stowe, and I saw some of his YouTube videos. And what struck me was, I admire your courage. I agree with your theology, but these thousands of snarky comments toward you, oh my God. It was appalling. My question is, I admire your courage. I admire your walking and thinking like Jesus. What do you do to build yourself back up again when you're attacked?
Well, I appreciate your saying that. It's it's a matter of being grounded in your spirituality, and I don't want to be so arrogant as to say I know I'm always right, because it's not the case. But I know where I'm coming from, and I don't see much justifiable in those comments. It's not about dialogue, but it's the very stuff that Pope Francis talks about here, where we can hide behind a screen and say all kinds of nasty things, or think that we're holier than the Pope, holier than the Bishop, holier than the Church itself. I try not to pay too much attention to them, is the simple answer to your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I apologize if I don't see them right away. I have to scroll through a couple pages of faces to see, so I might not always see right away. So feel free to just unmute yourself and start talking if I'm not calling on you.
It's Bev Miller. Thank you for all you do. I'm from Louisville, and we a lot of us think a lot of you here and follow you too. And talking about those people that are hateful to what you believe, and in our own lives, I think there's been so much that has split us politically and with Black Lives Matter. And I took this just a comment. I took a class not long ago on how to deal. It's nonviolent communication.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my good friends that I grew up with are just on the other side. And it got down in this class for me is that it's the trying to stay connected to them and not always argue about it all. And I was thinking about those people, how hard that is and how difficult that must be for you. I know it is for a lot of us. But anyway, this is just a comment. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
They're brothers and sisters too. They're not the ones I would choose to reach out to, but they're brothers and sisters also. And I have to challenge myself. Part of my work is with Pax Christi USA, and it's all about nonviolence and, that conversion of heart. I need it as much as anybody else to not respond with ugliness and to trust that Jesus showed us a way for a reason, and he didn't say it'd be easy for us.
Sister Tess, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, Patrick, but before me, I saw there was a question coming from the dining room in the chat. If you want to maybe pass it on to Bishop.
Oh, sure. Yes. The question in the chat says, how do you respond / challenge your brother bishops who are non-Samaritans?
Oh, I get that question all the time. Yeah, my first thing is I don't want to judge, but I do want to call them to recognize that the gospel gives us some pretty clear directives, and those things transcend loyalties to a particular theology or to a particular approach. A lot of the YouTube stuff, I'm guessing, has to do with my willingness to listen to the LGBTQ community and engage with them. And we have a difficult time with bishops in that area. Pope Francis says again and again that the church has to be a listening church as much as a teaching church. And I think that is so important. And I try to refer back to what the Pope says, but it's not always heard with openness or willingness. But I also get a lot of support from many other bishops who are not as willing to speak up, but are glad that somebody does.
So thank you, Bishop Stowe. So this is Tess Brown.
Hi, Tess.
I'm a sister of Charity of Nazareth here in Quincy, Massachusetts, outside of Boston.
Very good.
So, and many things struck me as you were speaking, but also with that last question, just want to encourage you to keep doing as Francis, to preach the gospel by who you are, if necessary, use words. But the fact that many of us, I know earlier on, even during the last 4 years, just seeing your comments really heartened us to keep going ourselves. For myself, I'm a Sister of Charity of Nazareth. Prior to that, I was a Franciscan, so I always tease and say I have Franciscan roots and charity wings. And I really, like when you went back and you started looking at what Pope Francis was using, like Francis of Assisi and 1219, that's always been such a strong thing for me of him going through the battle lines during that crusade at Damietta and going to see the Sultan, his brother. And when you brought in the idea of, neighbor, I love how you did like neighbors and neighborly, being neighborly, because, and one of the things, the first time I heard Gustavo Gutierrez when he was first here in the 70s at Mark, and he was speaking about, he did a play on the word prohimase, you know, the neighbor, and to make one close to oneself. And so it's, who is my neighbor? And even recently, when we had our convocation here on racial justice in the Archdiocese, and one of the questions came up of, well, you know, what do we do if we live in places where we don't see other people of color or people of color? What do we do? And, you know, the response that Father Oscar was passing, it was kind of how to go into other places. And so I like that idea that you brought of neighbor, because it's how do I become neighbor to the other? How do I go into a place and make myself neighbor and not waiting for the person next to me? And also you know, like when you speak about how we react to persons in church, whether it's the communion line, as Ms. Turner also brought up that experience before, or even here recently, I've just even heard of people going to communion and in like, say, for a funeral, and it was like, you know, predominant, it was in a white church. And a person who's Costa Rican but very dark was asked, you know, are you Catholic, when she went up for communion? And I've heard that a couple of times. But again, it's so, you know, out of what you're saying, from Fratelli Tutti, what are some other ways that can help us to make ourselves neighbor to the other, as we are even talking today about racism or about community, to build on what you say we have?
What you reminded me of just now is when I first came to Lexington, I don't know how many people I had to ask, where does the Hispanic community live? And so many people couldn't tell me. I said, well, they fill 2 churches. They're here somewhere. And it took a lot of work to find somebody who could bring me around and introduce me to that community. And it struck me that every place that I've lived and every place that I've visited, people make choices about what they know and what they don't know, and the fear that keeps them from going into certain neighborhoods. You know, so it's getting out of our comfort zone is the most important thing in this regard. And the church could do a great service, and parishes could do a great service. You know, if the parish is monocultural or is all predominantly one culture, then team up with another parish and allow people opportunities to connect, you know, breaking bread together. We have one of our parishes does a wonderful job with that, at least before the pandemic, was doing a wonderful job in bringing together the Hispanic community and the Anglo or the American community, and putting a couple bilingual people around at certain tables and just having them share a meal together, and no agenda, just tell your stories. And it's much harder to reject people when you know them face to face, and it's much easier to reject a category of people who is different or other. And I think the church is especially positioned to be able to create those kind of bridges. If we can get the people that most need to make those bridges and cross those bridges there. But, you know, in a time when we're homebound or we have other difficulties right now, sometimes it's through reading, you know, read novels from a different culture, a different background, read history. There's so much that we can do, even on Netflix, watching movies from a different culture, a different background. We can broaden our world, but nothing beats that encounter. I think Pope Francis is so correct on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Stowe.
Thank you.
Father Jim, go ahead.
Thank you. Bishop, I found you really articulate in the way you could weave, Francis's encyclical and then throwing in some of your own human experiences that you've had. And with that articulateness, could you give any suggestions about how to approach even family members who, boy, it is a very tender subject. You talk about tender, you referred to Pope Francis, but it's a very tender subject, even with family members or parishioners or anybody around us. And if they're taking another stance, I struggle with it. I struggle with being articulate myself to try to explain and not to change, just to explain the day that we're not talking 50 years ago, 100 years ago, racism. We're talking now. So I'm going to be quiet and just see you got any suggestions, I'm really open.
Well, I'll first say that as we got closer to the last election, I had to actually stop talking to people because it was so tense and there really was no listening going on. So you can't have a dialogue if only one side is speaking. But I have learned a few things from people like Brian Massengill about how people can be offended by white privilege, but white privilege doesn't mean that whites are wealthier necessarily than others. It doesn't mean, it's just trying to look at a historical context for the housing laws that kept people of color out of certain housing areas and how the taxation system for schools builds on that, how ghettos form, this whole social cultural thing that's there. But I don't know how you deal with people who deny that that's a reality. You know, your zip code, you know, when I talk about racism in parishes, I always start with anybody who chose the place of your birth, raise your hand. You know, anybody who chose the color of your skin, raise your hand. Anybody who chose your parents' economic status, raise your hand. And then if you had no choice about these matters, why do those three factors have so much to say about your life expectancy? Why do those three things have so much to say about your access to education, to wealth, your earning potential, et cetera? But if people don't want to hear, they won't hear, right? If there's none so blind as the one who will not see, and none so deaf as the one who will not hear. I wish I had better practical answers for you.
No, that's, yeah. Thank you.
We maybe have time for maybe one last one, if there are any last questions or comments. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing anything. So I guess that is a good place to call it a day. So I'd just like to once again thank Bishop Stowe for taking some time out to share your experience and expertise with us. I'd also just like to thank the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth Associates, Beth and Tammy, who helped me put this together. So they have a big role to play in these things being discussed with us today. And then Bishop Stowe, would you mind to maybe close us out with a final prayer?
Gladly.
Thank you.
Loving Creator, we come before you with grateful hearts for the gift of our life, for the gift of our world, for the call to be brothers and sisters to all. We thank you for the charism that unites us this day. We thank you for those who have gone ahead of us in religious life, in lay life. We thank you for the many witnesses and examples that they have given to us. We ask you for the grace to overcome the boundaries, the separation, the false notions of who is important and who isn't. And we ask for the grace to truly become neighbors and brothers and sisters to all. May this season of renewal, may this season of repentance, may this season of conversion open our hearts wide to be ambassadors of your Son, Jesus. We make our prayer through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Well, thank you all so much. I hope this was a good event for you all and that you learned a lot. See you all next time. Thanks again.
Good to be with you.
Trenton, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bishop. Good
Thank
to
you.
see some friends there down south. Stay warm.
You too.
Yeah.